So this will be a pretty short snippet where I show you a little bit more about the emissions of Australia, especially in a world context, because we're a really big emitter. On a global scale, there's 2 countries that are responsible for most emissions, the US and China. But then 19 other countries are responsible for the next 40% of emissions. So all in all, there's only 21 countries that produce the vast majority of greenhouse gases, which are causing global climate change. And Australia is one of the largest emitters overall, despite our small population. So what are the main emissions sectors? On a global scale, agriculture, forestry and other land use contributes about 24% of emissions, whereas electricity produces about 25% and industrial processes about 21%. You can find all that information in the IPCC reports. But in Australia, our main sources of emissions are electricity, so industrial processes generating electricity, other types of energy, and transport. There's also some emissions from industrial processes, and agriculture accounts for about 13% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And this is data for 2015-2016, which I found on the government website, National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. You can Google that for the most up-to-date information. But this was the most up-to-date when I made these lectures. So that is total emissions, where Australia contributes about 2% of the world emissions. But the scary thing is, when you look at a per capita data, so that is the amount of emissions per person, Australia leads the world. This is data for 2013, and Australian per capita emissions were a little bit over 25 tons of CO2 per year. That is more than any other country in the world. So what does this mean? Per capita emissions. It just means that we drive a lot of cars, that we have a lot of heavy industries, that we pretty much punch above our weight in terms of polluting the world. Go Australia. Now, one angle that's proposed by some politicians is that the emission intensity in Australia, which means the per capita, not quite the per capita emissions, it's the emissions per dollar of GDP, has fallen over the last 2 decades. So it means that our economy is growing, but the emission intensity, the emissions per dollar of GDP, is going down. And that's partly because our fuel is getting more and more expensive, and therefore we use less of it. But also our economy is changing from emission-intensive sectors to a more service-oriented sector. So if you look at the data, the emissions per capita are fairly stable. They seem to be going down, but really they're not going down. They're just pretty stable, and compared to the rest of the world, they're not. They're still, like I showed you in the previous graph, more than any other country. So let's not look at emission per capita. Lots of politicians say we should target the emission intensity, which is the emission per dollar of GDP, which is this red line here. And that's going down, so that's great. So what I want you to do while you having a bit of a break is ponder whether lower emission intensity will achieve our greenhouse gas targets. Will this reduction in emission intensity actually result in lower overall greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll come back to you after the break.